Rachel more woke to a voice slicing straight through her sleep. "Rachel, are you serious right now?" Susan Moore's sharp tone hovered inches from her ear. "It's almost noon, and you're still in bed." Rachel flinched and opened her eyes to the sight of her mother-in-law standing over her, arms crossed, lips tight with disapproval. For a brief, disoriented second, Rachel struggled to remember where she was. Then the weight of the past weeks settled back onto her chest. The condo, Seattle, 3 weeks of company that had already stretched far beyond endurance. "I went to sleep at 4, Rachel said quietly, her voice rough from exhaustion. "If you don't leave the bedroom right now, 4. Susan scoffed. "That's not an excuse. A grown woman doesn't sleep half the day while her husband goes hungry, and the apartment looks like this." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, pressing her fingers into the mattress. She could still feel the dull ache behind her temples, the kind that came from staring at a laptop screen for 16 hours straight. Deadlines, calls across time zones, work that paid the mortgage but never counted in Susan's eyes. Susan was already moving, yanking open the curtains. Harsh daylight flooded the room. "Honestly, I don't know how Daniel tolerates this. A real wife would have been up hours ago. Breakfast on the table. Shirts ironed." Rachel sat up slowly. She scanned the room. Nothing was out of place. The bed was made, the floor clear. But facts had never mattered during these mornings. From the hallway came the heavy sound of footsteps. Frank Moore appeared in the doorway, rubbing his stomach. "Is there food?" he asked bluntly. "All this sleep. And nothing's ready." Rachel swallowed. The condo no longer felt like hers. Every room had become a stage for inspection. Cabinets were opened without permission. Comments were delivered like verdicts. There was no corner where she could retreat without being watched, corrected, or judged. Normally, Susan and Frank visited only a few times a year. Rachel endured those weekends in silence for the sake of peace. But this visit had no end date. 3 weeks had passed, and still they acted as though they owned the place and her. Rachel swung her legs off the bed, keeping her expression carefully neutral. Anger burned beneath the surface, but she forced it down. Starting a fight before she was fully awake would only give Susan what she wanted. Still, as Susan continued listing everything Rachel had supposedly failed to do, one thought repeated itself with growing clarity. There was no safe space left in her own home. Susan did not stop once Rachel left the bedroom. Her voice followed Rachel into the kitchen, sharp and relentless. "I still don't understand what you do all night," she said, watching Rachel pour herself a glass of water. "Sitting at a laptop isn't work. Real jobs require leaving the house." Rachel kept her back turned as she drank. She had learned that responding only prolonged these conversations. Silence, however, had never stopped Susan before. Frank lowered himself into a chair and glanced around the kitchen with clear disappointment. "So what's for lunch?" he asked. "Or is that not part of your schedule either?" "There's food in the fridge," Rachel replied evenly. Susan clicked her tongue. "Salads again? Baked fish?" Daniel grew up on real meals. Hot food. Something filling. Not this diet nonsense. Rachel felt the familiar tightening in her chest. She remembered nights when she worked until dawn, balancing client calls from different time zones, reviewing contracts, managing projects that paid more than Daniel's monthly salary. None of it mattered here. In this apartment, her work was invisible because it did not look the way Susan believed work should look. "She doesn't even leave the house," Susan continued, turning to Frank as if Rachel were not standing there. "All day in pajamas tapping on keys. And she calls that a career." Rachel's fingers curled slightly around the edge of the counter. They had never asked what she did, never once questioned how the mortgage was paid on time every month. They saw only what fit their assumptions. Frank snorted. "If she really earned that much, we'd see it. Look at this place. No proper meals. No order. The words landed with dull familiarity. It was always the same script. Work dismissed. Effort ignored. Worth measured solely by how well she served others. Rachel moved to the stove and turned it on, more out of habit than intention. She could feel Susan watching her every move, ready to comment on how she held the pan, how she cut vegetables, how long she let the oil heat. "Daniel works hard," Susan said pointedly, "and he comes home to this." Rachel finally turned around. "Daniel hasn't complained." Susan's eyes narrowed. He wouldn't. He was raised better than that. The implication hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Rachel looked past them both, out toward the living room, where Daniel's laptop sat closed on a table. He was not there. He never was when these conversations happened. His absence felt louder than their voices. She returned her attention to the stove, her face calm, her movements controlled. Inside, something was slowly wearing down. Not breaking yet, but thinning with every careless word. This was not a single argument or a bad morning. It was a pattern, a steady erosion of respect, disguised as concern and tradition. And Rachel knew, with quiet certainty, that no amount of explanation would ever make them see the life she actually lived. Rachel had endured visits like this before. In the early years of her marriage, Susan and Frank came 2 or 3 times a year. Long weekends filled with comments, sighs, and unsolicited advice. Rachel swallowed her irritation then, telling herself it was temporary. They would leave. Life would return to normal. Peace, however fragile, was worth the effort. This time was different. 3 weeks had passed, and there was no sign of an end. No return tickets mentioned. No polite countdown. The condo had slowly stopped feeling like Rachel's home and started feeling like a space she merely occupied. What made it worse was Daniel's silence. He left early for work and returned late, conveniently missing every confrontation. When Susan criticized, rearranged, or scolded, Daniel was either on a call or too tired to get involved. Each time Rachel tried to bring it up, he brushed it aside. "She doesn't mean anything by it. Just ignore her. It'll blow over." It never did. By late morning, Susan had moved on from commentary to action. She began opening cabinets, pulling out dishes, stacking and res-tacking them according to her own logic. "These glasses don't belong here," she muttered. "And why would you keep spices so low? No wonder nothing tastes right." Rachel watched from the doorway as Susan handled her things without permission, sliding Rachel's notebooks aside, lifting decorative items and setting them elsewhere. Every touch felt like a quiet declaration of ownership. "This apartment needs order," Susan announced. "You can't live like this." Rachel's patience finally snapped. "Please stop," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I want you both to leave. Today." Susan froze, then turned slowly. Her expression shifted from surprise to outrage. "Leave," she repeated. "You're throwing us out." "I'm asking you to leave my home," Rachel said. Susan's face flushed. "Your home," she scoffed. "This is my son's apartment. Daniel invited us here. You don't get to decide who stays." Frank stepped forward. "You should remember your place," he added. "You didn't buy this place on your own." Rachel felt her pulse quicken. "We bought it together, with our savings, with a mortgage we're both responsible for." Susan waved a dismissive hand. "You never worked a real job. Everything here belongs to my son." The words hit harder than Rachel expected. Accusations followed quickly about money, about entitlement, about ingratitude. Her contributions were erased in real time, rewritten to suit their narrative. Rachel realized then that no explanation would change this. Facts were irrelevant. Respect was never on the table. And for the first time, she understood that tolerance had not kept the peace. It had only taught them how far they could go. Rachel did not raise her voice. She stood still in the middle of the living room, hands relaxed at her sides, and spoke with deliberate calm. "This apartment was purchased with joint savings," she said. "Daniel and I both contributed. We took out a long-term mortgage together. We are both legally responsible for it." Susan stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. "That's not how it works," she snapped. "My son is the one with the job. His name is on the papers. That makes it his." Rachel felt a familiar frustration stir, but she kept her tone even. "No one gave us money for this place. Not you. Not Frank. Every payment comes from our accounts. Every month." Frank scoffed loudly. "Listen to her," he said, turning to Susan. "All she thinks about is money. That's her problem. Always counting, always calculating." "It's not about counting," Rachel replied. "It's about facts." Susan stepped closer, her voice dropping into something sharper. "Facts don't matter when family is involved. Daniel is my son. This apartment exists because of him. Without him, you'd have nothing." Rachel's jaw tightened. She had expected denial, but the ease with which Susan erased her role still stunned her. Nights of work, the down payment, the years ahead of shared debt. All of it dismissed with a single sentence. "I pay the mortgage," Rachel said quietly. "Every month." Susan laughed, a short, cutting sound. "With what? Your little laptop games? Don't insult us." Frank crossed his arms. "You should be grateful you're allowed to live here at all." That was the moment Rachel understood that the conversation had slipped beyond reason. The words were no longer about ownership or money. They were about power, control, keeping her in a position where she had no voice. She glanced toward the hallway, half expecting Daniel to appear. He didn't. The apartment felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Continuing like this would lead nowhere. Without Daniel present, there was no balance, no witness. Just two people rewriting reality while she stood alone. Rachel took a slow breath. Arguing facts with people who refused to hear them was not only useless, it was draining, dangerous in a quieter way. "I'm done with this conversation," she said. Susan opened her mouth, ready with another accusation, but Rachel had already turned away. She knew now that staying would only give them more opportunities to diminish her, more chances to twist her words and wear her down. Logic had failed, respect was absent, and Rachel understood, with growing clarity, that the only way to protect herself was to remove herself entirely, at least for now. Rachel did not give them another word. She went straight to the bedroom, pulled on jeans and a hoodie, twisted her hair into a loose knot, and slid her laptop into her bag. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, as if she were leaving for an ordinary workday instead of escaping her own home. When she passed through the living room, Susan was still muttering complaints under her breath. Rachel did not respond. She simply opened the door and walked out, letting it slam shut behind her. The sound echoed down the hallway, sharp and final. Outside, the cool Seattle air hit her face. Rachel took a few steadying breaths before heading toward a cafe she knew well, a place where no one questioned why she worked for hours with headphones on and a laptop open. She ordered coffee, chose a corner table, and set up her computer. The familiar routine helped ground her. Work had always been the one space where effort translated into results. She tried to focus. Emails blurred together. Numbers refused to settle. Her mind kept drifting back to the apartment, to Susan's voice, Frank's dismissive laugh. The way Daniel's absence had hung over everything like a silent endorsement. Less than an hour later, her phone began to buzz. Rachel glanced at the screen and felt a wave of nausea. Message after message from Susan filled the display. The tone escalated quickly, from accusations to outright cruelty. Rachel was lazy, ungrateful, a disgrace as a wife. One message wished her misfortune outright, cloaked only thinly in bitter sarcasm. Rachel did not reply. Instead, She took screenshots. Every message. Every insult. She saved them carefully, her expression unreadable. Then she blocked Susan's number. Only after that did she open a new message and send the screenshots to Daniel. Her text was brief and controlled. "We need to talk. I'm at the cafe on Pine Street. Please come." She set the phone face down on the table and returned to her laptop. The cafe buzzed quietly around her. Strangers talking, cups clinking. Life continuing as usual. Rachel worked through the afternoon, exhaustion slowly replacing anger. By the time the light outside began to fade, she felt empty but steady. She had not yelled. She had not defended herself endlessly. She had documented the truth and stepped away. Whatever came next would have to be faced directly. Daniel arrived just after 6. Rachel saw him through the cafe window before he came inside, his shoulders tense, his jaw set. He didn't smile when he spotted her. He walked straight to the table, dropped into the chair across from her, and exhaled sharply. So he said, not bothering with a greeting, "What did you two fight about this time?" Rachel closed her laptop slowly and set it aside. "This isn't about another argument," she replied. "This is about what's been happening in our apartment." Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. "You have no idea what today was like," he said. "Mom had to take her blood pressure medication. The paramedics almost came. Dad didn't even get lunch. They're both exhausted. And I get messages from you like this." He gestured toward his phone. "Do you realize how this looks?" Rachel listened without interrupting. When he finished, she spoke evenly. "Your parents need to leave the apartment. Today." Daniel's head snapped up. "What?" "I can't live with them anymore," Rachel continued. "Not like this." "I won't." Daniel's expression hardened. "This is my home too," he said. "I have every right to have my parents stay here." "I'm not telling you to cut contact with them," Rachel replied. "I'm not asking you to stop helping them or seeing them. I'm asking you to respect my boundaries." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "So now I have to choose? Between my wife and my parents?" "You're choosing already," Rachel said quietly. "I'm just asking you to acknowledge it." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You're overreacting. They'll stay another week, maybe 2. I'll talk to Mom. She won't pressure you." Rachel shook her head once. "That's not an option." Daniel stared at her, incredulous. "You're really going to make this a legal issue?" "Yes," Rachel said. Her voice did not waver. "If your parents don't leave today, I will file for divorce. I will demand a legal division of the apartment and the mortgage. Everything will be split according to the law." The words hung between them, heavy and irreversible. Daniel searched her face, clearly expecting her to back down. She didn't. "This isn't about money," Rachel added. "It's about respect. And I don't have it in my own home." For a moment, Daniel said nothing. The noise of the cafe filled the space between them. Cups clattered. Someone laughed nearby. Finally, Daniel leaned back in his chair. "You're being dramatic," he said. "But fine. I'll talk to my mother." "Hakelstut Gellinghabeg." "Your answer tells me everything I need to know." She did not wait for a response. Daniel stood up as Rachel turned to leave. "Wait," he said, his voice sharp with frustration. "Do you even hear yourself right now? You're forcing me into an impossible position." Rachel stopped, but did not turn around. "You're making me choose," Daniel continued, "between my parents and my wife. Do you have any idea how unfair that is?" Rachel faced him slowly. Her expression was composed, almost distant. "I'm not asking you to abandon your parents," she said. "I never have." "That's exactly what you're doing," Daniel snapped. "You're putting conditions on my relationship with them." "No," Rachel replied. "I'm putting conditions on my own survival." Daniel shook his head. "This is extreme. You're blowing this out of proportion." Rachel studied him for a moment, searching his face for something she had hoped to see for a long time. Understanding or at least concern. She found neither. "I'm choosing myself," she said simply. "Because you won't." Daniel exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "Fine. I'll talk to Mom. They can stay one more week. Just one. After that they'll go. Can we please stop turning this into a disaster?" Rachel felt the last remaining uncertainty settle into clarity. One more week was not a compromise. It was confirmation. She reached for her bag. "I won't be coming back tonight," she said. "I'll stay with a friend." Daniel frowned. "You're really doing this?" "Yes." She met his gaze steadily. "Tomorrow I'll come by to collect my things. After that, we'll start the divorce process." Daniel's face drained of color. "You can't just decide that on your own." "I already have," Rachel replied. "I'm willing to handle this fairly. Either one of us buys out the other's share of the apartment, or we proceed with a legal division. The mortgage will be split according to the law. I'll send everything in writing." For the first time that evening, Daniel looked unsettled. But Rachel no longer felt the urge to explain herself further. As she walked toward the door, she understood something with painful clarity. This marriage had not ended because of money or work or even Susan and Frank. It had ended because, when it mattered most, Daniel chose silence over protection, comfort over courage. Outside, the evening air was cool and still. Rachel breathed deeply as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The hurt was there, sharp and undeniable, but beneath it was something else. Relief, for the first time in weeks. She was walking away on her own terms. The divorce moved faster than Rachel had expected. There were no dramatic scenes in court, no public arguments. Papers were filed, documents reviewed. The marriage itself dissolved quietly, as if it had already ended long before either of them admitted it out loud. The apartment, however, became something else entirely. Daniel refused every option Rachel proposed. He would not sell. He would not buy out her share. He insisted on joint ownership, framing it as fairness while knowing it trapped them both. The mortgage remained active, the payments ongoing, the responsibility shared whether they lived there or not. The court's ruling followed the law precisely. Ownership was split evenly. So was the remaining mortgage debt. Utility accounts were separated. On paper, everything looked balanced. In reality, it was a stalemate. Selling an apartment still under mortgage, with two unwilling owners, proved nearly impossible. Rachel understood quickly that waiting for Daniel to act would only keep her tied to a place that had already cost her enough. So she filed again. This time, she requested a physical division of space. The process was slow and procedural, stripped of emotion. Measurements were taken. Usage schedule discussed. In the end, the court assigned Rachel a specific room in the apartment, legally designated as her private property. Clear rules were established for shared areas. A lock was installed on her door. It was not a victory. It was a solution. Rachel had no intention of living under the same roof as Daniel. Instead, she rented out the room, the income covering her portion of the mortgage. With the rest of her earnings, she leased a small studio downtown, simple, quiet, and entirely her own. There were no arguments when she moved out, no accusations, no final confrontations. She packed her belongings methodically, ignoring Susan's comments and Frank's disapproval. Their words no longer reached her the way they once had. Life settled into a new rhythm. Rachel worked. She slept. She cooked when she wanted and ordered food when she didn't. The studio was modest, but it was peaceful. Every object inside it belonged to her, placed exactly where she chose. She did not consider herself a winner. There were losses, financial, emotional, and personal, but they were contained, manageable. Most importantly, they were hers to carry, not imposed by someone else's expectations or control. Occasionally, She heard updates through third parties. Daniel complained about the arrangement, about the inconvenience, about how complicated everything had become. Rachel said nothing. She had learned that not every battle required a response. Sometimes stability was the quietest form of resistance. Months passed without confrontation. Rachel poured herself into work, letting long days and structured routines do what time alone could not. The anger faded first. The sadness lingered longer, but even that softened as distance grew. She rarely thought about the apartment unless she had to. The updates came through a real estate agent she had hired to keep an eye on the situation. One afternoon, he called with a measured tone. Daniel had missed several mortgage payments. At first, it had been a delay, then another, and another. Rachel listened without reacting. She had expected this. Weeks later, the call came again. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings. Notices had been issued. Deadlines set. The situation was no longer theoretical. Rachel did not hesitate. She contacted the bank directly, requested the details, and made an offer. She would purchase Daniel's share of the apartment and, in the process, cover the outstanding mortgage balance and accumulated debt. The terms were strict, the timeline unforgiving, the amount substantial. Rachel agreed. For several weeks, she worked nearly around the clock. She took on additional projects, extended deadlines where possible, and cut every non-essential expense. Sleep became optional. The goal was clear, and she moved toward it with focused determination. When she submitted the funds, the bank confirmed the transaction. The paperwork was finalized. Ownership transferred. Rachel became the sole legal owner of the apartment. Daniel learned about it after the fact. He attempted to challenge the deal, claiming he had not been given a fair chance. The court disagreed. The documents were in order. The bank had followed procedure. Susan called repeatedly. Frank left messages demanding explanations and threatening legal action. Rachel did not respond to any of it. She blocked the numbers, deleted the voicemails, passed all communication through her attorney. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph, only quiet resolution. What Daniel had refused to decide for months had resolved itself through inaction. What Susan and Frank had tried to control through pressure and intimidation had slipped beyond their reach entirely. Rachel closed the file on her laptop and leaned back in her chair. For the first time since the marriage ended, the future felt unburdened. The consequences had arrived without drama, without shouting, without revenge, just results. Part 10. A home reclaimed. A life rebuilt target length. 370 words. The apartment felt different when Rachel returned to it. Nothing physical had changed, the walls, the windows, the familiar view of the city, but the weight that had once pressed down on her was gone. The space no longer carried voices that questioned her worth or hands that rearranged her life without permission. It was quiet in a way that felt earned. Rachel did not rush to move back in. She took her time. She replaced only what she wanted to keep, removed what reminded her of endurance mistaken for love, and left the rest behind. Each decision was deliberate, each step forward measured. Months later, she met Andrew Collins. There was no dramatic beginning, no promises made too early. Andrew was steady, attentive without intrusion, curious without judgment. He listened when Rachel spoke and did not interrupt when she fell silent. Their conversations unfolded naturally, about work, about boundaries, about the kind of life that felt honest rather than impressive. When they eventually decided to live together, it was Rachel who suggested the apartment, not as a test, not as a symbol, simply because it was hers. Standing in the living room one evening, Rachel looked around and understood something she hadn't before. The apartment had never been the source of her suffering. It had been the stage on which everything else was revealed. The silence, the avoidance, the absence of protection when she needed it most. The divorce had not been a failure of marriage alone. It had been a correction. Rachel no longer replayed arguments in her mind. She no longer wondered if she had asked for too much. The answer was clear now. She had asked for respect, and when it was denied, she had chosen herself. That choice had cost her comfort in the short term. It had demanded patience, discipline, and resolve, but it had given her something far more valuable in return: stability, autonomy, peace. When Rachel and Andrew talked about the future, about family, about change, it was without fear. There was no need to negotiate safety. It already existed. Late one night, after the city lights softened outside the windows, Rachel turned off her laptop and rested her head back against the couch. The apartment was quiet. The silence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like ownership. And for the first time in a long while, Rachel knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Rachel became the sole legal owner of the apartment without ceremony. There was no moment of celebration, no sense of triumph. The confirmation arrived as paperwork, signatures, and quiet emails from her attorney. When it was finished, the apartment that had once been the center of conflict belonged to her alone, legally, fully, without dispute. For a long time, Rachel did not think of it as a victory. She thought of it as survival. The space that had once felt hostile slowly transformed. Not because she renovated or redecorated extensively, but because the tension was gone. No one criticized how she lived. No one questioned her work, her schedule, or her right to rest. The silence inside the apartment no longer felt heavy. It felt stable. Months later, Rachel met Andrew Collins. There was nothing dramatic about their first conversations. Andrew was steady in a way that felt unfamiliar at first, present without being demanding, attentive without attempting to control. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He respected pauses. He never treated Rachel's independence as a threat. Their relationship unfolded naturally, without urgency or pressure. There were no ultimatums, no expectations disguised as concern. When they disagreed, it was done openly, without raised voices or manipulation. For Rachel, that alone felt significant. Eventually, Andrew spent more time at the apartment. When the decision was made to live together, it happened calmly, as a shared choice rather than an obligation. The apartment no longer carried the weight of past arguments. It had become a place of balance. Looking back, Rachel understood something she had once resisted. The divorce had been inevitable, not because of money or careers or even Daniel's parents, but because the foundation of her marriage had been absence. Absence of protection. Absence of partnership when it mattered most. The apartment was no longer just property. It stood as proof that boundaries matter. That self-respect carries a cost, but one worth paying. It represented the moment Rachel chose stability over endurance and clarity over compromise. Some evenings, she stood by the window, watching the city settle into night, and allowed herself a quiet sense of certainty. The future no longer felt threatening or uncertain. It felt open. Rachel did not regret what she had lost. She recognized what she had gained. And for the first time, that felt like enough.